which controls so large a proportion of a given product as to be able to determine the price and conditions of sale. The evil of a monopoly is that it destroys competition and leaves the producer at the mercy of a corporation which can then arbitrarily exact such profits as it pleases. There are certain results which naturally follow from the establishment of a private monopoly. First, corporations raise the price of products. Profit by a monopoly, while the masses are the victims of all monopolies. Monopolies are both corruptive and coercive. By large contributions to campaign funds, they purchase immunity from restraining legislation and from the enforcement of the law. And as they employ an army of laboring men, they can influence elections by threatening employees with starvation.
George and Herman Brown of the Brown and Root Construction Company. Johnson helped the Brown brothers build a billion-dollar construction empire. In turn, the Browns would fund Johnson's political campaigns.
Judgmentally, what I'd say is that they were a couple of guys who were making a lot of money out of the New Deal, and they didn't want to have to pay higher wage rates, so they were against the unions. It wasn't a matter of high principle. They wanted to get rich, and they did get rich. Well, Lyndon sidled up to them, or they sidled up to him, and they made book. I remember asking Johnson once in the White House, did you deal with cash? And he said it was all cash. I mean, there were no records. So in those circumstances, there were plenty of politicians who were selling out to business interests. I use a pejorative term. I don't know what other term to use. I mean, in TV, you have to use some shorthand. I mean, they were agreeing to be with those people in exchange for money, which they used in their campaigns. That's pretty close to selling out, isn't it? And everything is organized not like his father around ideas and ideals, but like the son around himself and his own career. Not to say that he is not therefore doing a lot of good. He brings real electricity to people that don't have it in his own district. Yeah, sure, he's really smart.
On May 2nd, 1939, George Brown wrote Johnson a letter. I hope you know, Lyndon, how I feel in reference to what you've done for me, and I'm going to try to show my appreciation through the years with actions rather than words.
That morning, as Johnson and Kennedy arrived in Dallas, a Maryland insurance agent, Don Reynolds, arrived on Capitol Hill to brief Republican staff members of the Rules Committee. He'd promised proof that the vice president had misused his office for personal gain. He showed the investigators invoices, documents, and diary entries he claimed implicated the vice president.
Don presented a good case. He could back it up. Everything he said he had a receipt for. It's hard to argue with a receipt or a canceled check or an invoice. It's hard to argue with documentation.
At 3:30, Chief Counselor Van Kirk was called out of the deposition to be told Jack Kennedy had been killed, that Lyndon Johnson had been sworn in as the 36th President of the United States.
Preserve, protect, defend the Constitution of the United States. Constitution of the United States. So help me God.
I knew that if I went back in and told Don Reynolds that Lyndon Johnson was the new president, Kennedy was dead, he'd clam up. So I just went back in and said nothing, and we continued the interview for another 2 or 3 hours. And I tried to get every bit of information out of him I could.
The tragedy in Dallas stalled the investigation for a while. Johnson had no idea that as he was being sworn in, Reynolds was handing over evidence the Republicans hoped to use to impeach him. All he knew at that stage was that continuity was essential, that his team should include all the dead president's staff. This included his nemesis, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy.
For many minutes this afternoon, there was nobody actually at the helm of this great republic. The president lay dead of an assassin's bullet. The vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was incommunicado in a hospital suffering from shock. But now, just moments ago, Lyndon B. Johnson has been sworn in as the President of the United States. What is the position that he occupied in terms of his relationship with John F. Kennedy before this act today?
One of the key men in this case is Clint Murchison. Clint Murchison is an oil millionaire, owned 500 companies, but he was primarily an oil millionaire. He also controlled Texas, controlled Johnson. His major means of operating and controlling people and influencing people was a little hotel called the Hotel Del Charro in La Jolla, California. It cost $100 a day in the 50s. And at that hotel, he would invite all these powerful, influential people. Richard Nixon would come there. Key lieutenants of Carlos Marcello, the head of the mafia in New Orleans, used to vacation there. J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, used to vacation there, free. Every summer for 10 summers, free.
Another Johnson man with close ties to Murchison was a wealthy Texan called D.H. Byrd.
D.H. Byrd was an underboss for Murchison. He was a Del Charro regular. He owned the Texas School Book Depository. He also founded the Civil Air Patrol, which was a kind of military organization, and Lee Harvey Oswald was a member of the Civil Air Patrol. Another associate of Murchison at the time is Bobby Baker. Bobby Baker's in trouble with the scandals, and he was in all kinds of business deals with Murchison, and many of them were illegal. So Murchison was concerned that Baker and that corruption would lead to his door. And maybe not only would Baker go to jail and Lyndon go to jail, but maybe Murchison would go to jail.
Clint Murchison Sr. was one of the wealthiest men in Texas. He was an old-time wildcatter. And he and Sid Richardson had bought the license to run a famous racetrack in California called Del Mar. J. Edgar Hoover spent each August at their racetrack in their box and as their guest in their suite at the hotel there.
Hoover's own snapshots hinted how Murchison, too, indulged Hoover's taste for a one-way bet.
He invested in oil wells, and if the oil well went dry, he got his money back. Before he purchased stock, he wanted to know what the inside information was. He got it, then purchased stock, which is all illegal for any citizen.
And old man Murchison told me that the most important person in the world to be close to was the sheriff, and he owned a piece of Mr. Hoover because he felt by making certain that he had the box on the finish line, paying his hotel bills and his food bills, that he owned a piece of Hoover. No doubt about it. He was immune practically from any federal investigation of any of his activities.
And was Hoover's attitude toward organized crime influenced by the generosity of a Murchison or a Rosenstiel? One day, the gangster Meyer Lansky spoke about his virtual immunity from the FBI.
He says, if you'll note, he says he doesn't go after anybody like Santo, myself, Carlos in Louisiana. He says he doesn't touch any of us.
Santos Trafficante was the mafia chieftain in Tampa. Carlos Marcello was the godfather of New Orleans.
And I says, you mean to tell me that you pay off Hoover? And he said, absolutely not. He wouldn't take a penny in front, especially from a guy like me. And he laughed. I said, well, how do you do it? He says, I know at least a half a dozen of his friends that are friends of mine. And he went like this to show like quotes. He says, and they take pretty good care of me.
But Hoover's gambling and his dubious friendships never tarnished his image. To the public, Hoover was a real-life hero. He and Clyde Tolson were treated like movie stars. The two snappily dressed bachelors were often seen in New York's most fashionable night spots. One of their favorite hangouts was the Stork Club, managed by Sherman Billingsley, who used to place illegal bets for them. It was here one New Year's Eve that Hoover and Tolson betrayed the secret they shared, a secret that could have destroyed Hoover's reputation and his career.
Well, it was a wonderful night at the Stork Club. It was New Year's Eve, 1936, and I was the only woman at the table.
Louisa Stewart, a famous model, and her boyfriend Art Arthur had been invited to join Hoover and Tolson at Walter Winchell's table.
We all had on those crazy hats and the things you blew, and at one point I'm pointing a toy gun at Hoover, who has his hands up, and it was just a great night. It was getting really late, and Hoover was rather annoyed with Clyde. He thought Clyde had too much to drink. And finally the decision was to go to the Cotton Club up in Harlem. The only one my own. We went in the FBI limousine, and Art and I sat in the back seat, and Clyde and Jedgar, as we called him, sat in the two jump seats. And then I saw that they were holding hands. And I guess he was forgiving him, but I thought it was sort of odd. Without a love of my own. I remember the Cotton Club that night very well, because there were a couple there who were black and white dancing together. And that made Hoover furious. And then Clyde, who was still pretty drunk, said, well, he'd like to dance with Hoover, which we all thought was very funny. Well, we left, finally, and in the taxi going home, then Art said to me, it's common knowledge that they're queer, that they're fairies. Those are the terms used in those days. But he said, we don't talk about it.
Whether we like it or not, it's always been true that a public man's private sex life makes him vulnerable. Hoover knew this. He would eventually seek out one of the most distinguished psychiatrists in Washington to ask for advice and help, because he was so terrorized by his own sexuality. What was he, as director of the FBI, to do about these urges that he had?
In Washington, D.C., police detectives were picking up intelligence about Hoover's private life.
Guy Hoddle was a retired or fired agent. He was an alcoholic. And Huddle would, every time he had a few drinks, he would tell stories about parties that went on in J. Edgar Hoover's house when that there were sex parties there, no girls. So when you say sex parties, what does that mean if you have no girls?
I remember Ash Resnick at the Caesar's Palace. He used to be the manager of the nightclub there. He told me that Meyer Lansky had some pretty strong evidence that Hoover and Tolson were both homosexuals.
When he was asked what that meant, he said that Lansky had obtained photographs of Hoover in a compromising situation with Clyde Tolson.
One man who actually claims to have seen such photographs is Gordon Novell, a controversial figure with connections to the intelligence community. Novell, who had worked for the White House in the early 1960s, became involved in a complicated legal action which the White House wanted him to pursue, but which Hoover wanted dropped.
So I went to the White House, and the White House sent me to Mr. Angleton, Director of Counterintelligence, CIA. We met in a restaurant, and I told him my problem, and he says, I know what your problem is. He said, you need to tell Mr. Hoover that you've met with me and that you're not going to dismiss the lawsuit and that you've seen this. At which point he opened up his briefcase and pulled out a couple of photographs of Mr. Hoover in flagrante delicto, I guess is one way to describe it. Having oral sex.
This testimony does not stand alone. I talked to a former regular officer in the OSS, that's the predecessor of the CIA, who said that after the war, he went to dinner with other OSS American intelligence colleagues, and that after dinner, when over the brandy stage, when conversation turned to the private lives of public people, his host went out of the room and then came back with a photograph. And this was passed around the table, and the photograph showed two men, Hoover and Tolson, engaged in homosexual activity.
In New Orleans, where the CIA and the Mafia had sometimes collaborated, Mafia Don Carlos Marcello told Gordon Novell that he, too, had seen a photograph.
I had volunteered the information that I had seen a picture of Mr. Hoover in performing oral sex, and he said that he had seen it, too, and that had been used to keep the FBI, but not the Justice Department, off the back of the mob.
Meyer Lansky had some pretty heavy stuff on Hoover, that he was a homosexual, without any question. And he'd shove it to him if he ever had to.
Irving Resnick said Lansky was the guy who controlled the pictures, and he had made his deal with Hoover to lay off. That was the reason that for a long time we had nothing to fear from the FBI.
In the 40s, we hardly touched organized crime because the Bureau did not believe that there was a mafia, or did not allow us to investigate the mafia as such.
For the vital decades of the Mafia's growth, Hoover denied that nationally syndicated organized crime existed and ignored all evidence that it did.
There wasn't one mention of the Mafia. There wasn't one mention of organized crime activities during the training course that I and all other brand new FBI agents went through in Washington. Not one mention of it.
In fact, the Bureau in Washington had no organized crime division. When I went to the supervisor in Seattle and asked why we weren't going after the Mafia, he said, we don't use that word. Hoover doesn't acknowledge that there's a Mafia.
Mr. Kennedy, do you expect to delve into any particular fields when you take over as Attorney General?
Well, I think that there are a number of different areas where action is needed. I think that in the field of organized crime, I think it's a very serious situation that's facing the country at the present time.
Before the Kennedys,
the mob had literally been getting away with murder.
The glory years for the mob were right after the Second World War, right up to 1960. That was it.
Nick Pileggi has written about the mob for 30 years and was co-author of the movie Goodfellas.
They owned politicians, they owned unions, they could actually socialize. The FBI said they didn't exist. I mean, it was unbelievable, it was glorious.
Now, would you explain what debating a place means? Well,
Jack and Robert Kennedy had studied the mob since 1957, when they took the lead on the McClellan Committee's investigation of organized crime and its association with organized labor. They focused on Jimmy Hoffa, president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the largest union in the country. They were quick to clash.
I would like to say, Senator, that if you're trying to penalize the American labor movement for Hoffa, or for your dislike for Hoffa, then spell it out in the law, exempting everybody except Hoffa. Will you please?
Well, we're exempting everyone but racketeers and hoodlums and crooks.
I would like to have you draft that language, sir.
I'm not talking necessarily...
As Attorney General, Robert Kennedy was determined to convert his knowledge of the mob into a new national policy. Don't define it. Do something about it, he told the young lawyers he recruited for this mission. Robert Blakey was one of those lawyers.
You just can't know how inefficient and complicated and inept the government is unless it's held together in some way by the force of somebody's personality. Robert Kennedy had that and did that.
He forced FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to shift manpower and resources away from hunting communists to busting gangsters. He surfaced mob informant Joe Valachi in a nationally televised hearing.
Then he picks your finger. Who? The Godfather. He picks your finger? He picks your finger with a needle. Makes a little blood come out. In other words, that's the express, the blood relation. Supposed to be like brothers. That's the letting of blood. That's right.
All of us in that position.
Under Robert Kennedy, successful prosecutions of organized crime figures increased 700%.
By 1963, J. Edgar Hoover was becoming isolated and entrenched within the FBI he had created. Then, just after lunchtime on November 22nd, Hoover called his boss, Bobby Kennedy, to tell him that his brother, the president, had been shot in Dallas.
Got a call from Bobby saying that the president was dead, that he'd gotten a call from Hoover. And Bobby said, I think Hoover enjoyed telling me.
The next day, while most of the United States was reeling with the size of the tragedy, Hoover went to the races. And what work he did in terms of the FBI's follow-up on the assassination, he did on the telephone from his box at the races.
This is Tony Lewis, taping with Bob Kennedy, and why don't we talk now about the relationship with Mr. Hoover and the FBI?
The relationship between Bobby and Hoover could be summarized in a word: blackmail.
Do you now think that Mr. Hoover is a dangerous person, or just nasty?
No, I think he's dangerous.
Did you ever have the feeling that he knew a very great deal about you, personally?
I suppose every month he'd send somebody around to give information on a member of my family or myself so that it would be clear that he was on top of all of these things and received all of this information. I really deferred to him. I made it real effort because I knew that he didn't like me. He is rather a psycho, and I used to keep his ego up. We used to arrange for him every 2 or 3 months, go over and have lunch alone with the president. I made a fuss over him.
When I say blackmail, I had in mind also Hoover's knowledge of President Kennedy's trysts, shall we say. And he, I think, made it very plain to Robert Kennedy that he knew all about it. And Kennedy knew that Hoover would not hesitate to use it against his brother.
I remember one occasion he said that my brother and I had a group of girls on the 12th floor of the LaSalle Hotel, and that the president used to go over there once a week and have the place surrounded by Secret Service people and then go up and have assignations. And a lot of it was so far-fetched. I mean, it was ridiculous on the face of it.
Now, more with G. Gordon Liddy.
Mr. Hoover would send someone such as I up to Capitol Hill to knock on the senator's door to apologize for the intrusion on his privacy from Mr. Hoover and to assure him that Mr. Hoover had seen to it that that bit of information had been removed from the files, and say that Mr. Hoover counsels you, sir, with all due respect, that if we could stumble upon this, so too might your political enemies. Then the fellow would sort of wipe his brow, thank Mr. Hoover, and I would return.
We do know from other congressmen and senators that have been through this that he'd always say, don't worry, I know about it, but you're okay. I think it was subtle blackmail, and they did too. One of the reasons I think Hoover stayed on years after the civil service rules said he should retire is that I think a lot of presidents were afraid to drop the hammer on him.
Presidents went to him before they were elected to pledge that they would keep him in office. Democrats went to him, Republicans went to him. They had conferences. And he sat there like a king. And the next president was saying, yes, if I'm elected, I'll keep you in office, period.
In the 1950s, a man who would be president was apparently having an affair with a young woman in this Washington townhouse. Inevitably, a photograph of the man leaving in the early morning found its way into Hoover's growing file on Senator John F. Kennedy. The day after he was elected president, John Kennedy reappointed J. Edgar Hoover as director of the FBI. Hoover's immediate boss would be Robert Kennedy, an attorney general determined to crack down on organized crime.
When Robert Kennedy became the Attorney General of the United States, we had an intensified investigation of organized crime.
The FBI agents who were interested in organized crime, who had been working very, very hard, thought they had died and went to heaven when Robert Kennedy became the Attorney General.
Hoover wanted no part in Robert Kennedy's war on organized crime. The FBI director fought back with the weapon he knew best.
Hoover was such a power at that time that he would actually send memos to the Attorney General and saying, I thought you'd be interested knowing that your brother, the president, had such and such a girlfriend, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
One such girlfriend was Judith Exner, then Judith Campbell.
The relationship that I had with Jack from early 1960, Hoover knew all about that, and he used that as leverage.
FBI wiretaps had revealed that when Judith Campbell wanted to contact John Kennedy, she placed her calls to his devoted secretary, Evelyn Lincoln.
Well, in this one instance, he sent a memorandum on March the 20th, 1962, saying that there was a young lady that had made 90 calls to the White House, to Evelyn Lincoln. And did you know that she is connected with the mafia? And he would have an appointment.
Ironically, the wiretaps that Robert Kennedy had forced Hoover to place on mafiosi like Sam Giancana's henchman, Johnny Roselli, revealed that both men knew Judith Campbell.
So they arranged a luncheon day, March 22nd, 1962, at which time they discussed the telephone calls.
And during that meeting, he let him know face to face that he knew about Jack's relationship with me. Right after the meeting, Jack called me. He was furious because in his eyes he felt that he just couldn't believe that Hoover would have the audacity to do this face to face and, in a sense, try to threaten him.
Hoover's files may have helped him keep his job, but nothing could stop Bobby Kennedy's war on the mafia, and by now, even Hoover had been forced to do something about it.
Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover, over many years, had an unusually close personal and professional relationship. And it all had to do with Hoover's power and Johnson's power.
It was no surprise that President Johnson reappointed Hoover. What has not been known is the part Hoover may have played in Johnson becoming president at all. This part of Hoover's secret history goes back to the 1960 Democratic Convention, when Kennedy and Johnson were both seeking the nomination. Kennedy joked that Johnson should remain a senator.
So I come to you today full of admiration for Senator Johnson, full of affection for him, strongly in support of him for majority leader, and I'm confident that in that position, we're all going to be able to work together. Thank you.
Behind the smiles, it was an intense fight. But Johnson enjoyed the secret support of J. Edgar Hoover and his files.
Lyndon Johnson told me that J. Edgar Hoover loathed and despised both Bobby Kennedy and President Kennedy, and that J. Edgar Hoover had extensive files on President Kennedy's womanizing.
When Kennedy won the nomination, he surprised almost everyone by asking Johnson to be vice president. Until now, history has recorded that Kennedy only made the offer as a goodwill gesture and was shocked when Johnson accepted. The Johnson nomination has always been a mystery because the Kennedy brothers made the decision in secret and vowed never to tell what happened. But one other person did hear parts of their private conversation at the Biltmore Hotel, Evelyn Lincoln.
And when I came in there, they were huddled together closely on the bed discussing this tremendous issue about Lyndon B. Johnson being on the ticket. Bobby would get up and go look out the window and stare. Kennedy would sit there and think. It was intense. In fact, they hardly knew I came into the room. They were so engrossed in their conversation. That went on for 30 minutes, trying to figure out how they could maneuver to get it so he wouldn't be on the ticket.
Evelyn Lincoln says that what she heard that day convinced her the Kennedys were being blackmailed.
One of the factors that made John F. Kennedy choose Lyndon B. Johnson for vice president were the malicious rumors that were fed to Lyndon B. Johnson by J. Edgar Hoover about his womanizing. And so that's one of the reasons that pushed him to go down and offer him the vice presidency. Lyndon B. Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover had boxed them into a hole. They were absolutely boxed in.
And so history was made. Lyndon Johnson ran on the Democratic ticket and eventually became the 36th president of the United States. The Kennedys may have kept their secret, but more than 30 years later, the one surviving eyewitness has broken her silence.
Robert Kennedy said, "We both promised each other that we'd never tell what happened that day."
But I am telling what happened.
1 week after the death of JFK, Lyndon Johnson placed a call to J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI. The Kennedys had kept Hoover at arm's length, dangerous as a rattlesnake he'd once been called. But that wasn't Johnson's style. He wanted to keep Hoover inside the tent, as this curious little exchange illustrates.
You're more than the head of the Federal Bureau as far as I'm concerned. You're my brother and personal friend, and you have been for 25, 30 years. I got more confidence in your judgment than anybody in town. And I certainly appreciate your confidence. Well, thank you. Thank you.
We are especially fortunate to have Mr. Hoover's strong personal dedication to maintaining the high standards of protection for civil liberties of the individual under our system of law.
The answer is vigorous law enforcement.
That's the only answer.
That's the only answer.
How about justice? You hear a lot about justice with law enforcement.
Justice is merely incidental to law and order. Law and order is what covers the whole picture.
The President would like to talk to Mr. J. Edgar Hoover. Thank you.
Hello, Edgar. Yes, Mr. President. I don't hear you well. What's the matter?
matter? You got this phone tapped?
Don't know.
I'm wondering if our wires are tapped at all. Every time I say something in the State Department, I read about it. And it's getting me frightened to even take a call.
I was in the room in Johnson's bedroom with Johnson and John Connally, the three of us alone, on the morning of the nomination for the vice presidency at about 10:30, when Bobby Kennedy stormed in and started screaming at Johnson that if he knew what was good for him, he'd get off that ticket.
Well, Johnson did not like Bobby Kennedy, and it was mutual. They hated each other. So what happened was that Mr. Rayburn and John Connally went in to meet with Bobby Kennedy.
Bobby Kennedy said that all hell had broken loose on the convention floor and that Johnson was going to have to withdraw, just change his mind and not accept the vice presidency. And Mr. Rayburn looked at him and he said, "Oh," and uttered an expletive that I'm not going to use.
Old man Rayburn said, "Shit, Sonny," and kicked him out.
And I am grateful, finally, that I can rely in the coming months on many others, on a distinguished running mate who brings unity and strength to our platform and our ticket, Lyndon Johnson.
And that was a real transformation in which this young pup, Jack Kennedy, suddenly is it. And he, Lyndon Johnson, big old clumsy Lyndon Johnson, is playing second fiddle. And you got to believe it, that those vice presidential years were agony for him.
It was a terrible sense of having lost that center of dominance. And suddenly, I think he felt like a little kid looking in a glass door at the candy display inside, and he couldn't quite reach it. It was devastating.
It wasn't the way the president treated him. I think Jack Kennedy treated him with due respect. But everybody around Kennedy kind of poked fun at him and made mockery of whatever happened to Lyndon Johnson.
And Kennedy, you know, named him head of the Space Center. Plus, he sent him on every foreign trip in the history of the world to, you know, try to give him something to do.
Vice President Johnson made ceremonial visits to 26 countries. But he wasn't the kind of man who could get the feel for another culture. Wherever he went, he took his own oversized bed, a special nozzle for his shower, dozens of cases of Cutty Sark, and thousands of personally inscribed ballpoint pens and cigarette lighters as gifts. But at least abroad, he was center stage. At home, there were still the Kennedys. Urbane, charismatic, immensely popular.
He was consumed with this passion of inferiority towards the Kennedys. And they gave him a very hard time when he was vice president. They were going to dump him from their ticket. They made a buffoon of him, a laughingstock. When, as vice president of the United States, he visited Scandinavia, Bobby Kennedy sent an uncoded telegram to the embassies, uncoded so that everyone could see it, saying that the vice president in no way speaks for the government of the United States and is not to be received as if he were an emissary of the president.
As the forces hostile to Kennedy grew in strength and number, they began to think the unthinkable: assassination. Finally, a new imperative forced their hand.
Lyndon Johnson was in big trouble. The Bobby Baker scandal and the Billy Celeste scandal could destroy Lyndon Johnson's career. Lyndon Johnson would go to jail, and he was their man. He represented all these right-wing forces. There was an urgency to kill President Kennedy. They had to save Lyndon Johnson. The governor of Texas, first of all, is Lyndon Johnson's best friend in history. They went back decades together. In the 1948 vote scandal, John Connally was every much a part of that cover-up that took place. He was his campaign manager. It is, without question, John Connally who entices John F. Kennedy to Texas. Once they get him there, then they're in control of everything. Motorcade routes, the evidence, the Dallas police, everything. It's their land. It's their territory. Lyndon Johnson and his Texas cronies suckered President Kennedy to Texas.
Actually, Lyndon Baines Johnson had at least one thing in common with John F. Kennedy.
He was a great womanizer and was someone who, when they tell him about John Kennedy's womanizing, he'd bang the table and say, damn it to hell, I had more women by accident than he ever had on purpose.
The stories of Johnson's affairs are like the man himself, larger than life and somewhat less than refined. Like Kennedy, LBJ allegedly used his secretaries for more than taking dictation.
I was told on good authority that he had sex with a secretary. Johnson came in her office one day, and the story goes that he pulled down the shades, locked the door, and they had sex on a desk in the White House. But that apparently was a one-time thing. It wasn't a sustained relationship.
But Johnson reportedly had extended affairs with at least 2 women back home in Texas.
As old as I am and as long as it's been, my toes still turn up when I think of him.
Madeline Brown was a 23-year-old radio advertising sales representative when she met Congressman Lyndon Johnson at a station party. A few weeks later, he invited her to another party at the Driscoll Hotel in Austin.
And while I was dancing with him there at the Driscoll, he put a key in my hand, and of course I was old enough to know what it was for.
It was the beginning, Brown says, of an affair that lasted for 21 years, and one she claims that produced a son, Stephen, in 1950.
He was a spitting image. Stephen was as much like his father, Lyndon, as 2 peas in a pod. Their feet, I think, was size 13. Their height, his build, he was exactly like his father.
Growing up, Stephen never knew the identity of his father, but Brown says she tried to get Johnson to acknowledge Stephen during their last meeting in 1969.
And he said it'd been too many years, too many heartaches, and it would hurt Lady Bird and the girls.
Brown eventually told her son who his father was, and in 1987, Stephen Brown filed a $10.5 million lawsuit against Lady Bird Johnson, claiming that he had been deprived of his birthright. Before the suit could be tried, Stephen Brown died of lymphatic cancer.
Stephen didn't know during most of his life, however, that LBJ was his alleged dad, did he?
No.
Why didn't you tell your son?
I was told. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything. I didn't repeat anything. And it would have been political suicide for Lyndon to have acknowledged us at that time.
Hey, why don't you just read the letter that Jerome Ragsdale, attorney and counsel at law, who was he, first of all?
He was the attorney. I don't have my glasses.
Oh, you don't have your glasses?
Anyway, he was Lyndon's attorney, and he was the liaison between Jess Kellum and
Dear
Lyndon.
Madeline, thank you so much for breaking your plans and meeting with Jess and me. Who's Jess?
That was his hatchet man,
His hatchet
Jess
man.
Kellum.
Okay, Jess and me in Houston last week. I sincerely hope, it's dated incidentally May 18th, 1973. When did LBJ pass away?
He died in January of '73.
So this is several months after he passed away. Okay, I sincerely hope we did not inconvenience you in any way. Those of us who are close to Lyndon are saddened by his recent death. It is fortunate that he died at the ranch. He would have wanted it that way. It is unfortunate, however, that he died so bitter and tormented. As we discussed in Houston, you have my personal assurance that I will continue with the financial arrangements that Lyndon provided for you and Steve throughout the past. I know you are very concerned about this, and I simply wanted to relieve your mind. As always, if you need additional funds for you and Steve's living expenses, please do not hesitate to call me. Of course, I will continue to make weekly home visits to verify you and Steve's welfare. Sincerely yours, Jerome T. Ragsdale, attorney and counselor at law based in Dallas, Texas. What were the financial arrangements, Madeline? How much was it?
My home was paid for, and I had a maid, and I had credit cards, and I had whatever my needs were.
Did you, Madeline, have any encounters with LBJ either immediately before or immediately following the assassination of
Yes,
John
the
Kennedy?
morning of the assassination, he was angry, but he was always angry when Ralph Yarborough and John Connally, there was a political feud going on
Senator
in
Yarborough
Dallas.
of Texas, Governor John Connally of Texas at the time.
He, and I had planned a meeting that night in Austin. We were going to the big fundraiser. And he said, well, after today, the blank Kennedys would never embarrass him again. That was no threat. That was a promise. And I kind of laughed it off. I said, oh, after the rendezvous, everything's going to be great. Well, Jess Kellum had called me also, and he was telling me
Hatchet Man?
Yeah, the Hatchet Man. And I said, oh, Jess, he'll be okay. He's just mad. You know, everything's going to be all right.
Why was he so mad at JFK?
The Kennedys were always putting him down and calling him the country bumpkin, and he just didn't like it. They were a stumbling block in his way, politically.
When he said that to you, did you take it seriously?
Not at that second. I just thought he was mad.
Did you talk to him at all after the tragedy, after the
yes.
horrible crime?
I met him in Austin on New Year's Eve. And I was real concerned about it because everyone in Dallas was talking about he was responsible for the assassination. So I said to him, Lyndon, I said, you had already told me that after that day, the Kennedys wouldn't embarrass you again. And then Jack Ruby had come out openly and said that Lyndon Johnson was the cause of it. So I said, I've got to be in my mind, I've got to put things to rest. And he had a temper fit. He blew up and just screamed and hollered, and then he calmed down, and he turned around, and he said at that time it was the oil people I knew and the CIA.
Wait, are you saying that Lyndon Johnson, was he now President of the United States?
Yes.
Said to you personally?
Yes.
You swear this?
Swear.
That the oil people and the CIA were involved in the murder of John Kennedy?
Yes.
LBJ said that to you?
Yes.
Was it just the two of you alone?
Yes.
You sure it's not that the passage of years have made your memory foggy?
No.
You're not embellishing this tale, man?
No.
You sit here today and you claim that LBJ said the oil people and the CIA...
Scout's honor.
...killed the president.
Right.
What'd you say?
Well, I was, of course, deeply upset, and I thought, well, I'll never see him again. I can't handle this. But because of Stephen and because of some of the other things, when Jess had called me to come to Austin, I always went.
When was the last time you saw President Johnson?
I saw him in Houston, Texas. I had been in a real bad car wreck, and I had undergone lots of plastic surgery. And I thought that perhaps maybe I had healed well enough to see him, and just called, and he said he wanted to see me. And the astronauts that had landed on the moon, they were having a big party there in Houston, and we had all been invited. So when Jess told me to come to Houston, I thought, well, I was well enough that I could go. And I met him at the Shamrock Hotel in Houston.
The year?
August of '69.
Do you believe that your former paramour, Lyndon Johnson, had anything at all to do with the death of John Kennedy?
No, I did not have anything.
Do you believe that he had anything to do with it?
Oh, yes. Yes, I do.
You do?
Yes.
As you sit there today, you do?
Yes.
Did you know what he was talking about?
I knew the people that he named, yes, I certainly did. H.L. Hunt was a very dear friend of mine, and 3 days prior to the assassination, H.L. Hunt gave me one of the wanted for treason pamphlets, and they just bombarded Dallas with it. And
Wanted for treason, JFK.
Uh-huh.
They thought that the liberal president was a treasonous man.
Right.
Selling the country down the river.
So I said, H.L., you cannot do the President of the United States that way. And he said, well, hell, I can. I'm the richest man in the world. I can do whatever I want to. But Dallas, Texas was bombarded, and he passed them out personally.
Number one, what I do in my book is I perform a criminal investigation of Lyndon Johnson. And while the Warren Commission performed a criminal investigation of Lee Harvey Oswald and determined him to be a murderer without a motive, If you take all of these other possible parties who could have killed the president and combined all their motives together, they wouldn't have as many as Lyndon Johnson himself. He had personal motives, he had economic motives, he had political motives. We start with motive. Then from there we go to opportunity. Lyndon Johnson was involved in planning the trip. After we go to opportunity and you look at the Texas Connection, which is what my book is about, everything that was involved in this assassination, pre and post, Lyndon Johnson was involved in. We can go to Jack Ruby. Ask Madeline Brown how she met Jack Ruby.
Did you meet Jack Ruby, Madeline?
Lyndon Johnson's attorney introduced me to him.
Go on.
I'm serious.
Where?
I was coming out of Neiman Marcus and happened, of course, I knew the attorney, and he was standing talking to Jack Ruby, and he says, I want you to meet Jack Ruby. And so I
Wait a second. When was this?
Oh, 1952, I think, way back.
10 years before the assassination?
Oh, yeah.
So Lyndon Johnson's attorney, which one?
Jerome Ragsdale.
The same guy who wrote you the letter
Yes.
after LBJ died and said that the financial arrangements would be continued. He was standing with Jack Ruby, you say?
Yes.
Did you ever tell any of the authorities this?
Yes.
Who'd you tell?
Well, I told, well, not the Warren Commission. They didn't talk to me.
They didn't ask you to testify?
No, I was told.
Go on.
I was told if they contacted me in any way.
They should watch some talk shows, these guys. What'd you say, James?
I said the Warren Commission didn't even talk to the closest witnesses to the assassination. Bill and Gail Newman, you know, they were right there. We all remember the pictures of them shielding their children on the grassy knoll. Warren Commission didn't even talk to them.
And there were over a dozen witnesses on the overpass, every one of which was aware that the shots came from the grassy knoll, from behind the stockade fence. Only one was called. And when he said that the others saw the same things that he did, they didn't call any of the others.
Craig Zerbel, who picked the Warren Commission?
Let me just tell you this. What these two men are saying, who are experts in the assassination, is absolutely true. The Warren Commission was a politically biased entity created by Lyndon Johnson for the sole purpose of getting him out of another political scandal. This one, of course, the worst of his career. And the reason I say that, if you look back in history, 1963, November 22nd, what happened? The Texans came out and they said it was a lone killing, a lone assassin. And if you look at law, at the killing of a president in 1963, if it was caused by a lone assassin, was only subject to state jurisdiction, not federal. And Texans came out and they said it was a lone killing. Therefore, they had exclusive jurisdiction to investigate the case and prosecute.
Craig, are you indicting the whole Lone Star State in your theory?
I don't have to, Geraldo, and the reason for that is, if you look at history, and no one is going to deny it on this panel, on the evening of the assassination, the truth of the matter is Lyndon Johnson called people in Dallas, including the Dallas District Attorney, and told him to charge Lee Harvey Oswald with being a lone assassin, regardless of whether anything else he could prove.
Do you allege that LBJ himself called together a group of co-conspirators and said to them, I want this man dead, I want him to be killed in Dallas?